department's review concluded that a series of major failures were made by law enforcement lawyers and others responding to the mass shooting at Robb Elementary. As a result, 33 students and 3 of their teachers, many of whom have been shot, were trapped in a room with an active shooter for over an hour as law enforcement officials remained outside. And I told the families gathered last night their loved ones deserve better.
An absolutely gut-wrenching press conference earlier today by Attorney General Merrick Garland, detailing the failures documented by a Department of Justice report on the law enforcement response to the shooting at Robb Elementary in Uvalde, Texas, where 19 children and 2 of their teachers were killed by a gunman. The report calls the local law enforcement response, quote, cascading failures of leadership, decision-making, tactics, policy, and training, adding that the most significant failure was that responding officers should have immediately recognized the incident as an active shooter situation, using the resources and equipment that were sufficient to push forward immediately and continuously toward the threat until entry was made into classrooms and the threat was eliminated. Well, Attorney General Merrick Garland and the Justice Department emphasized the importance of learning from the failures in Uvalde so that nothing like this ever happens again. The parents and loved ones of the 21 children and 2 teachers killed that day, and the survivors are still trying to make sense of the horrific events of that day, May 24th, 2022.
That's something that I will forever not be able to comprehend in my mind, that it took so long that, you know, I mean, there was one guy, you know, I don't know.
It still hurts every time that we talk about it. Something like this, it's unbearable. You know, people tend to say, get over it, go on. How can you? That's your child.
As of right now, there has been no justice or accountability for any of the law officers that were there. We're still stuck on May 24th.
Joining our conversation, former chief spokesman for the DOJ and former senior advisor to Attorney General Garland, Anthony Coley. Maya and Rick are back with us as well. We always have this conversation about accountability and justice and how they are not one in the same. Today we saw a step toward accountability, but there will never be justice for these families.
There can't be justice for these families. They've lost too much, and it can't be given back to them. What's so important about this report, though, is it reminds us what we know and what we've always known, which is we have to have significantly more oversight on policing. One of the things we've called for in the civil rights community, the leadership conference has called for it, and others is, you know, federal government is giving grants to local law enforcement. Yet there's an opportunity in doing that to request and require oversight in exchange for getting our taxpayer dollars. And that's a critically important tool, particularly for small departments. You know, small departments aren't like everyone will pay attention to New York City Police Department because it's massive. Mm-hmm. And it's still unaccountable, by the way. But smaller departments really fly under the radar, particularly in rural communities. And for communities of color, immigrant communities, communities that often don't have the same access to being heard and listened to, whether it's by news media or by politicians, it's extremely important to use the purse string and the federal government's ability to have oversight and accountability to assure that everyone is getting the protection that they need and deserve.
Anthony, I want to read to you a little bit from the report. The report details so many things that happened, not just during the shooting, but after the active shooting was over. Quote, at the hospital and the reunification center, some families were reunited with their children, but other families received incorrect information suggesting their family members had survived when they had not. And others were notified of the deaths of their family members by personnel untrained in delivering such painful news. At one point, an official incorrectly reported that an additional bus was coming to the reunification center, creating hope that more kids were alive. At another point, the family of a deceased victim was told that their child was still at the school, giving them hope that they could be reunified with their child. It is pretty horrifying, Anthony, hard to read. I can't imagine how hard it was to live. How did so much go wrong here?
Yeah, you know what? Thank you, Alicia. This is every parent's worst nightmare, right? I think what struck me in the lead up into this segment is the father who said it took so long. And think about that. This was for 77 minutes. Law enforcement failed to intervene. And during that period of time, families were outside. They were begging for police to do their jobs. And what struck me the most about this report, Alicia, is that there were 10 instances, they called them stimuli events, where law enforcement are trained to intervene. 6 of those 10 stimuli events were gunshots that were heard within the classroom. Now, typically these gunshots in active shooter situations are calls to action, but that didn't happen here. The other thing that's really disturbing about me is the fact that these families are trying to turn their pain into action. And particularly in the state of Texas, after this massacre, they moved to urge the Texas legislature to not ban the type of semi-assault weapon that was used in this shooting, but to simply change the age from 18 to 21 by which an individual can acquire it. The Texas legislature, Republicans in the Texas legislature said no. And that just blows my mind that in addition to these families losing their loved ones, that Republicans in Texas can essentially thumb their nose at these families. And that, to me, in addition to the lives lost, that to me is the travesty of this whole situation.
Right, I am with you there, and I remember being on the ground in Uvalde in the days that followed and standing there with State Senator Roland Gutierrez. And one of the things he said to me was, Alicia, you need to understand about this community that there are going to be big questions about resources, right? Will they have access to the mental health care resources that they need, right? You're talking about rebuilding, you're talking about healing. No, like we don't have the basic infrastructure in place for that to be possible. And part of what we have watched here is how hard these parents have had to fight for 2 things in tandem. They've had to fight for accountability. They've had to fight for information, basic information about what it was that happened on that day, while a subset of them is also pushing for gun safety legislation that has been very difficult to move forward, especially in a state like Texas.
Yeah, it's heart-wrenching. I mean, these families have suffered the worst thing that any human being can suffer, the loss of a child. And then they've suffered the lesser indignities of not being taken seriously, of not having the resources to deal with it, of not being told the truth. It's awful. But I would say that there's nothing consoling about it, but you do see the Justice Department in Washington, D.C. coming in here and spending millions of dollars to actually do a study of this and to find the accountability. I mean, I do think this is something that the federal government should be praised for, and I would think that the parents are grateful for it too. But they've suffered the greatest hurt that a person could suffer, and then they suffered the further indignities of not being taken seriously.